Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a great event for you guys here. We're going to be talking about how to stay safe in the cloud. I don't mean use an umbrella. I mean, hey, what can we do for our security purposes? So no parachutes are required for today's roundtable. We've got a great couple of panelists with us today from CenturyLink and Zerto. So let's get things rolling here with a round of introductions. First off, my name is Lee. You'll notice I am not Justin Ong, who's usually with these guys. Today, we've got with us Derek Adair and Terry. I'm going to screw up your last name, so I'm not going to say it. You can say it later, Terry. But thanks for joining us. Starting off with Derek here, let us know a little bit about what you do at Zerto. What does Zerto do, and what's your role in the company?
Sure. Thanks for having us. My name's Derek Adair. As you said, I'm a cloud architect at Zerto. My role is basically working with newer CSPs, working with them through their architecture, planning how they're going to onboard their customers, designing their environment, and basically, getting these pre-validated CSPs. We don't just let anyone sign up to be a Zerto CSP. There's a vetting process, helping them get up and running so that they can securely serve their customers with DR, with IT resilience, and the value of Zerto, which there's tremendous business value in Zerto. We're talking about obviously DR and replication, which are the traditional value propositions when you talk about disaster recovery. But what Zerto's doing now is we're really talking about multi-cloud and bringing that into play here, where we're embracing not only your private cloud as an end user, but using partners like Terry to create a hybrid cloud where they are the central pivot point that you move your data to, from, and around to other public clouds. So Azure, AWS, these clouds are in play, IBM Cloud, to be able to leverage, to be able to tier your cloud offerings for giving your workloads, your site, the ability to recover seamlessly, easily, whether you're recovering in the cloud, whether you're recovering on-prem. We're there with a virtual solution that is doing continuous block level replication of the VMs, and we do that in a very unique way that limits bandwidth, saves cost on the bandwidth on the disk, is able to perform SQL operations for disaster recovery, which has obviously been one of the trouble spots for replication for a very long time. So I invite you to look deeper into the Zerto solution, and here's Terry.
Awesome. One thing I do want to
thank you, Derek.
We've got IT. Sorry. One quick second, Terry. For anyone out there who's a new IT pro, just because acronyms can throw people off, CSP, you mean cloud service provider, correct?
You got it. That's
right.
right.
We got all levels here. And of course, Terry, you're with CenturyLink. Can you let us know a little bit about what you do with CenturyLink? Of course, what does CenturyLink do? We know it does a lot of things and all that jazz.
Sure. So I'm Terry Barbunis. That's my last name for anybody that was wondering. I am a cybersecurity evangelist, which is a cool title for somebody that tells a lot of stories, basically. So my role within CenturyLink is I try to connect the dots between the threat landscape, the real world issues that are happening around security, and mapping them to the business problems that our customers have, from Fortune 100 companies all the way down to small and medium. CenturyLink, for those that may not be aware, is, and we may have moved up on this list since we acquired Level 3, but we are the third largest telecommunications provider in North America. We've got something like 450,000 miles of fiber. We're in 80 countries. We have over 100,000 buildings lit and on net. Obviously we're a global tier 1 provider. That's what most people know us as, but we also offer everything from hybrid cloud, hybrid IT and cloud. We actually run our own private cloud platform called CenturyLink Cloud. And then we do a lot with managed services. And so my purview, working for a company like CenturyLink and with partners like Zerto, my purview is that of a company that in many cases is much larger than our customers. We get attacked more often. As a telecommunication provider, we're considered a critical infrastructure player by Homeland Security, which means we get to sit at the table with cool organizations like FEMA. We get to inform the DOJ. We provide a ton of resources to the federal government. And so because of that, I get to see a lot to help inform our customers. And so that's basically my goal, is to help connect the dots and make sure that folks like yourselves are aware of the types of things that are happening out there if you're not, and how to remediate them.
Awesome. Thanks for that info, Terry. Before we go any further, of course, I've got a few housekeeping items I need to cover. Spiceheads, as you know, there's a console at the bottom of your screen. There you'll see a section that lets you see our speaker info with all of our little fun faces. There's a resource list. You can get into the chat. And of course, we have a Q&A section. Please, during the webinar, toss any questions you have for our panelists over to us. We'll go through them and get as much to them as we can as possible. And that's really probably the most important thing here, because we want these guys to field your questions rather than just what we ask them. And of course, I know everybody's wondering it. At the end of the session today, we will be giving away a grand prize of a Ring Doorbell Pro. So good luck to everyone out there. We'll be announcing that at the end. And we can move into our questions now. Everybody ready? Yeah. So the first thing I have for you guys today is, how impacted are cloud hosting providers by, the vulnerabilities recently announced of Intel and AMD with Spectre and Meltdown? Should IT pros be concerned about this? Is this something you guys are already addressing?
So I can kick off with that. So it's definitely something that cloud providers are addressing. As a matter of fact, I would say for an organization that isn't using any cloud, it may be a bigger concern of running your own infrastructure because of what Spectre and Meltdown mean, right? So the Meltdown, just as a refresher, basically it breaks the isolation between applications and the operating system and allows a rogue program to access memory that should otherwise not be accessible. Spectre, on the other hand, basically breaks isolation between different applications and allows normally error-prone, error-free applications to be tricked into doing things, leaking their secrets that they shouldn't have. This is probably one of the largest security-related issues that modern technology has seen because of how wide it is. It's not just Intel and AMD, it's also ARM. And although on the Meltdown side, a lot of this is being remediated through software patches, in a lot of cases, these machines need to be rebooted, which means if you're a cloud provider, especially the scale of an AWS or an Azure, you have to make sure that you maintain your SLAs while still patching your environment. However, the one thing about cloud providers that I tell people all the time is it is beyond above board for them to maintain an insane level of security. They would be out of business with the caliber of customers and workloads that they have if they weren't already on this. And as a matter of fact, I've heard that a lot of the larger cloud providers already knew that this was going to be announced, even though the general announcement hadn't been done yet, and we're already remediating. CenturyLink had issued a statement because, again, we not only operate a public cloud, but we also are a managed hosting provider. So the entire environment up and down is servers. Intel just announced today that they were actually redesigning their processors that is slated to be released later this year and into next year to remediate the Spectre issue. But it's a concern. Cloud providers are acting as quickly as possible. It's in their best interest. That's, they don't have a business if this sort of thing starts affecting customers. If you are not in the cloud, then quite honestly, it could be a bigger issue because all of this remediation takes time, it takes staff, it takes money. And depending on the size organization that you are, it may be a bigger issue for you than it would be if your workloads were in the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add there, you know, Zerto CSPs have certainly patched their environments. The Kaiser patch was out. Intel, Microsoft, Google have all had patches on this. So what you need to look out for is, what is the performance hit going to be from these patches, right? This is really about, you know, things that these chipset CPU manufacturers did to speed up the process, right? We're doing speculative execution. We're trying to, you know, basically funnel out in different directions of what could possibly happen, so that when it's time to execute, we go down the path that's already been done. But with the patches, that's going to take away some of the power and the speed of that CPU. I know there's some lawsuits around that for Intel, which I'm sorry for them for that. But, you know, basically that is the thing to be concerned with and to look at, I think, over and above the issue itself.
Now, the nice thing with that, if people are using a cloud service provider, is some of that can be mitigated by the provider, couldn't it? Since if you're running everything in-house, if you have that performance hit, you have to buy new systems if you want to do everything. The cloud can just say, let's provision a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Something
yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. You know, I think in addition to this threat, you know, of Spectre and Meltdown, you know, there's also the threat of ransomware, which is a tremendous, you know, threat that has been coming up. And, you know, since 2013, we've seen all these issues and problems around it. Customers need to be sure that they are, you know, they have intrusion detection, prevention, but over and above that, you know, the reality is you're never going to stop these things. They're always going to be coming. You need to have a plan for threat mitigation. Now, Zerto gives you the ability to roll back to specific points in time, you know, generally every 5 seconds or so. So very granular spots to restore to if you should have any issues with your data. So that gives you the ability to go back in the logs, see the point in time it happened, bring up your environment in a test bubble, make sure that everything is, you know, as you want it to be, as you expect it to be. And then at that point, we kill the failover test and we do a live failover. Boom. You didn't have to pay the ransomware. We had an example of a customer that was going on with a CSP in January. They were going to go on January 12th. They pushed to the 29th. On the 28th, they got hit with ransomware. It was 3.5 Bitcoins. Now, 3.5 Bitcoins, you know, last year, an admin could just pull their credit card out of their pocket and save their job. Mm-hmm. Where Bitcoin is now, it's, you know, that customer had to pay $50,000, right? You can't hide that from your CEO. You have to have a plan in place to be able to come back, you know, from these issues. And I would just, you know, add that Zerto gives you the capability to do that very granularly. You're not going back 4 hours. You're not going back 24 hours. You're not telling the tape truck to come in. We'll see you in 2 weeks. You know, we can restore immediately to a point in time that is acceptable to you.
Awesome. And so, you know, with security being such an important thing, whether it's on-prem or cloud, of course, we're talking cloud, what are some really important questions to be asking our cloud hosting providers to really make sure they're above board, that they're taking the proper precautions with our data? Anything you think people should really be going out and asking?
Yeah, I think the big thing with cloud, to make sure that, and I want to refresh this because it comes up all the time, is every public cloud provider will tell you that cloud security is a shared responsibility, right? Which means that when you look at certifications that an AWS has, for example, right? Everything from FedRAMP to ITAR to CGIS, PCI, and so forth. That doesn't mean that you can offload your responsibility as a customer in protecting your data to your cloud provider. Mm-hmm. It simply means that the cloud provider has taken steps at the platform level, at the infrastructure level, to be able to do things like pass physical access controls when like a PCI auditor came in. The customer still has a responsibility. And so you want to make sure that as a customer of any cloud provider, you understand where that line is, because I've run into this all the time. And there's a lot of finger pointing that happens, but it's definitely something to ask your cloud provider. The second thing is look at the types of certifications they have. Ask what type of credentials, Derek mentioned earlier about some of their folks being credentialed and trained and so forth to be able to mitigate these types of things. Ask about both physical security, and if you're in a, ask about isolation, ask about when's the last time that you experienced a breach, for example. Again, if you're dealing with a large cloud provider, they will have covered themselves 9 ways to Sunday. The biggest issue, quite honestly, when issues do come up, and we'll use AWS and S3 as an example, is misconfiguration, right? AWS, if you use the product or if you've been in their console recently, they've actually changed the GUI so that it's more apparent whether a bucket is public or not public. And so in the majority of cases with breaches that I've seen with customers, and typically it'll happen through a third party. We see this a lot in the government where they hire a third party to manage some data. They put that data into S3 without the customer knowing in some cases, and then they go one step further and somehow they make that folder public. And so that's a big issue. Obviously, know who has control. And going back to asking your cloud provider, what kind of controls are in place for me to be able to know down to the individual, down to the application who has access. In a lot of the large breaches, if you remember a couple of years ago, the Anthem breach, where there were over 1 million patient records that were taken, somewhere in that line. In the final analysis, it ended up being access to a database, and that access belonged to somebody who had no business being in that database. Right, and so the important thing is there are things you can ask the cloud provider, but you can't abdicate your responsibility as a customer, especially when it comes to the data, just because a cloud provider has certifications and they haven't reported any breaches and so forth. There's still a tremendous responsibility to the customer to understand where everything is, who has access, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's about identifying synergies with your CSP, around audit, compliance, making sure you have secure multi-tenancy. What is your connectivity going to look like? Those are really 4 pillars that you want to focus on when you're talking to your CSP, to be able to understand what their services are and what they're providing. I think the most important thing about a CSP, from an end user perspective is, you want to find a partner that you can lock arms with, that will guide you through this process. You don't want this to be a 7th grade science experiment for yourselves that you're going to show at the science fair. This is something that is your data that is very critical. It's, essential to your business. Obviously, you can't run without it. So it's very important to make sure that those things are taken care of. As you approach your CSP and they guide you through it, make sure you follow their instructions, make sure that your environment is in the condition that it is expected to be in. And there may be modifications that need to be made, to be able to, have the security that you're looking for, the ability to be compliant, the ability to audit properly. And I would encourage you to find ways to make any changes that your CSP would ask you to do that's in your own best interests.
Awesome. Terry, one thing I want to say is thank you for asking about past breaches, because in IT, I know we often think about uptime and downtime, and we're very good about asking that question. But I know from past experience, we forget to ask about, have you been attacked? What have you done in the past? So I think that's a great question.
Yeah, and the one thing with, and again, we see this all the time because of the types of customers and the scale that we operate at is, even though from a publicly traded company perspective, since 2011, the Security Exchange Commission has had guidance that any publicly traded company that gets breached, a material breach, needs to basically report it. And that's because for a publicly traded company, it basically affects stakeholders. Look what happened with Equifax recently with the arrest of the COO for trading on insider info, basically. And so that hasn't really had a lot of teeth in it from the perspective that because of the reputational damage, companies don't want to report that. And unfortunately for public traded companies, the SEC hasn't done a lot I mean, you've seen some, again, the recent arrest with Equifax and so forth. But at the end of the day, they remediate it, they take the hit, and then their stock price goes back up. Publicly traded companies like Microsoft and Amazon, again, because of the scale that they operate on, are somewhat more forthcoming because of the impact. Unlike even a large individual company, the impact that a platform like AWS would have in a breach is absolutely massive. And so you still want to ask. I mean, if you ask even if you already know the question, because you want to hear their answer. I do that all the time, because if they're not going to be upfront with you before you even sign at the dotted line, you probably should think twice about it. But yeah, breaches, they're important. And then, like you said, it's equally important to hear what they've done, how it impacted the customer. But with the public, with the AWS and Azure, and then CenturyLink does it with CLC, notification to the customer should happen, even before they've asked. But it's always a good question to bring up.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So are there any security precautions that our IT pros out there listening today should really be exploring from a networking perspective when it comes to a cloud service provider?
So I think certainly anytime you're going to be accessing anything, you want to make sure that to use a secure connection. For example, when we have customers that are doing PCI and HIPAA workloads within our public cloud, we want to make sure that we set up that we advise them, because ultimately it's the customer's decision, set up a private connection, a VPN, and so forth within the platform itself. And all these platforms have all these controls in place. They all have some aspect of networking security controls that you can go in and tweak and set up based on your applications and your workloads. Now, having said that, I defer back to my prior comment about misconfigurations. And so you want to make sure that when you enable things like that, A, you're not inadvertently breaking your application, and B, and more importantly, you're not inadvertently opening up a Pandora's box where somebody can come along later and be able to exploit something that you've done on the security side from networking. Furthermore, there's also CenturyLink. One of the things that we do with customers all the time is we have a specific network product that is designed to basically connect CenturyLink customers with multiple cloud providers. So it's basically a dedicated connection that's purpose-built to easily be able to take a customer that's using CenturyLink for their network and be able to connect to AWS and Azure and so forth. And those connections all come with a level of security right out of the box, if you will. Because as a networking company, it would probably not be a good idea for us to have a breach in one of our networking products. Mm-hmm. It's probably, I could say it's probably identical when it comes to networking, whether you go to AWS or Verizon and so forth. Again, that's their core business. And so the short of leaving a port open that somebody's going to exploit across the network connection, the bigger concern for me is always the how you actually protect that data and where it sits and who has access.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add, intrusion protection and intrusion detection, 24/7 monitoring, DDoS mitigation. Those are all things you should be asking about as well if you're CSP, just to make sure that they have the technology in place to keep you protected.
Right.
And are you seeing that some of the newer technologies out there, or becoming more common technologies out there, such as software-defined networking, are really help mitigate risk of network intrusion for cloud-hosted data? Are you seeing much of an impact with that these days as people change to use that?
I haven't come up. It hasn't come up in my recent conversations with executives. However, it is something that's very much, on the table for every network provider. It could certainly help to mitigate risk. Again, you put a caveat around that as somebody misconfiguration and so forth. And the way that it mitigates risk is it gives you a level of centralization over your network security services, your policies, your configuration management, your blocking of malicious traffic, network auditing, and things like that. And so the fact that you can centralize all that, basically use the same pane of glass to control those policies across your infrastructure estate, helps to reduce any errors anything you might miss because it's using multiple interfaces or multiple configurations. The other thing that you see a lot of these days, and CenturyLink is playing in this game as well, is the use of a CASB, of a cloud access security broker. So here again, you have an organization that on-prem or cloud, that provides either on-prem or cloud-based policy enforcement point between various cloud services and consumers. CenturyLink, for example, uses a product from Delta Risk that we've basically integrated into the rest of our security stack that touches not just CLC, not just CenturyLink Cloud, but can touch all the other clouds out there. So visibility, compliance, data security, and then threat protection. So that's the other thing I wanted to mention, because a lot of customers are taking that approach.
Okay. And so, another risk to people, cloud usage and using a cloud service provider, of course, is always people who have to worry about what happens if my network connection goes down. Some people are blessed and have great network connections. I myself in my previous organization was not. So, what are really the best ways to implement some backup and recovery for network configurations that include those cloud applications?
I can speak from a Zerto perspective, right?
Yeah.
In terms of what we're doing, when the link goes down, we're still continuing the replication, holding that on the production side. When that link's back up, we ship everything, all the deltas, all the changes that have happened during that time, we ship those back over. So we also give you the capability of, when your production site literally goes down completely, God forbid, you're able to restore on the recovery side. Everything that you need is over there, your replica disk, your journal. We will spin up the VMs either in a failover test network. We can do that in a production network. We can allow you to keep your IP addresses that you have on-prem. If you want to change those IP addresses when it gets to the recovery side, you can do that as well. Zerto includes all the automation with that. So it makes it very easy for you to be able to make those changes. And I would let Terry take that, in terms of, scope for a CSP, and then how that would be handled.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, depending on the customer, depending on the workloads, first of all, from a network perspective, you have customers that are either on MPLS with multiple points, multiple clouds, that they're constantly moving workloads between for resiliency. In the case of somebody like AWS, because of their whole availability zone availability, there you have, typically you'll have a customer who's got multiple redundant connections into those availability zones. But here again, if you don't have an application that's been designed to work with multiple availability zones, you get the types of things that you've seen when the East Coast availability zone goes down, and major SaaS applications go down with it, right? I think the best at doing that has always been Netflix, in my experience, even back when they were on the Amazon network before they broke off and created their own. And so I want to say, I know you hate that kind of answer, but it kind of depends. For one, it starts to get expensive depending on the level of redundancy. Like Derek said, you can certainly have something like Zerto that handles a lot of that. Then you have to make sure that if it really is that critical, that you have network redundancy, whether you have dedicated connections like some of our larger customers do, or you have multiple facilities where you're also running backups and so forth across your WAN by leveraging something like MPLS. But it's definitely, obviously when we put all of our everything in one pot, like these cloud platforms. We've seen these outages before. Depending on the criticality and depending on the budget, you're either going to do it or you're not. And if you don't, you're willing to take on the risk that you may have some downtime.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for that information, guys. We do have a whole bunch of questions from our IT pros today. So if you guys are up for it, feel like getting some questions?
Bring it on.
All right. So the first one I've got today here from Eric Wojo out there. He says, can we do anything to mitigate possible ransomware that a SaaS provider may have or may run into? Like, what should they do in that case? Or how are SaaS providers working to deal with the higher threat landscape of malware and ransomware these days?
Yeah, so the question was specific, I see it here, specific to the provider actually getting malware and ransomware. I can tell you, and again, I can only speak to CenturyLink from a provider perspective. We have an entire cybersecurity defense team whose only job is basically protecting CenturyLink, our networks, and the customers that use that network from those types of issues. I haven't heard, certainly within CenturyLink, I haven't heard with the other providers having ransomware that specifically affected the SaaS provider and their customers. It's not that it doesn't happen, and malware is obviously all over the place, but typically your large providers will have certainly a defense in depth. In the case of CenturyLink, again, because of some of the work we also did with the federal government, we actually actively go out and collect malware and actually analyze them and explode them within a sandbox environment to see what they would do. And we use part of that research to basically inform a lot of the AV providers, for example, because of the purview that we have. And so I can't answer the question from the perspective of how do you deal with it if your SaaS provider does. I would think that if they value their business, that they would be communicating with the customers and doing everything they can to mitigate it. But at the same time, it's beyond table stakes for them, especially for a critical infrastructure player the caliber of CenturyLink, to basically be sitting on top of these network pipes, everything from email to denial of service attacks and so forth, and be mitigating those. So I don't know if that's the correct answer to the question, but I'm just basing it on my own experience.
Yeah, and from a Zerto perspective,
answer its scope.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when that, as I said, and I said this already, when that threat gets through, and it's going to, one way or another, at some point, you're going to get hit with this, maybe on-prem. CenturyLink does a great job with what their, cloud does and the actions they perform that Terry just outlined. But, being able to go back to those very granular points in time and restore basically, to 5 seconds before you got hit. If you're on top of your environment and you got hit, you're going to be able to take care of that. Now, from a SaaS perspective, that's really on that SaaS provider, right? They need to have Zerto too. So I would check and see what they have for their protection.
So start one of those questions you ask your providers from now on is, are you using Zerto? Would you be willing to?
If you please.
With the mention earlier from Jimmy T out there, with the mention earlier of asking the cloud provider questions like the physical security and accreditations, have you or really anyone who's done that in the past and received responses from the really large companies like Microsoft, Google, AWS? Do you know of any specific, have you heard from any of your users, or maybe like in CenturyLink's case, have you guys been asked that? And do you guys go into any real detail with it?
Yeah, so we get asked all the time, whether it's CenturyLink or Microsoft or AWS, all of those, their accreditations and their policies and so forth are all posted on their websites. I know with AWS, they if you go to forgot the URL, but it's their Trust Center, the Microsoft Trust Center. You can see everything from the SOC 1, 2, and 3 reports, which is reporting on physical infrastructure within their data centers, and then you can basically drill down from there. I have heard more than once, we do it all the time in asking those companies directly. I think where issues come in is if you are, it's one thing to be an enterprise customer working with a provider, whether it's, and I'm sure Derek, Zerto, you're in the same place. You have a relationship with those providers that allows you to pick up the phone, even on behalf of your customers, and say, hey, I'm working on an opportunity. This is the detail that this customer wants to know above and beyond what you have published on your websites. Now, they're not going to, there are certainly times when you may be asking something that encroaches on, either that encroaches on some detail because it's security that they're not going to divulge. But more often than not, the questions are more straightforward. It's more clarification on the sort of the generic type of information that they have within their trust centers. But absolutely, we do it all the time. Our customers have done it all the time. In a lot of cases, larger customers also work with companies like Gartner and Forrester. They can provide that kind of insight as well. So it isn't an impossibility. If you're an individual working from home, trying to get some of these details with no connections and you're not sure, who to call, then yes, it could certainly be an issue. But if you're even an SMB company, especially if you're working for a partner, that partner typically has those inroads into those organizations to be able to figure it out. I mean, Derek, yeah, I'm sure with Zerto.
No, that's the answer. That's the answer, right? It's finding the right partner that's going to get you those answers, right? Going and trying to get those answers from a behemoth like Microsoft and AWS, if it's not documented, right? Everything's documented for the most part, right, unless, as Terry said, it's something that they don't want to document because it's a secret. So having the right partner that's going to be able to go to bat for you, get that information for you, that's super important.
Yep.
Awesome. So from T. Roberts out there, he's got a question going, is the total cloud worth investing in, or is hybrid best in the SMB market? How can you justify in a small business going full on cloud, embracing it all, or do you think small businesses should really be looking at the hybrid side right now?
You want me to start with that one, Derek, or you want to take it?
Yeah, you can start with that one. I would say, I'll start actually. I would say that is as Terry said, it depends, right? That's a really loaded question. I personally see hybrid cloud as the solution that customers and companies have decided on that are not starting from scratch, right? If you have an infrastructure already, what we're seeing is a lot of customers are retiring that secondary data center and putting that in the cloud with DRaaS, and that's kind of their first toe dip into the cloud. And then customers are getting comfortable with that and then possibly thinking about, well, how do we do this? How do we go about moving our production into the cloud? What's that going to look like? How much is it going to cost? How easily can it be facilitated by our partner? So I think that is the solution. The default de facto solution for the market right now is hybrid cloud. I think that, the economies of scale that are happening now in the cloud and the constant price pressure to drop is making it more viable to be able to do production in the cloud. And I really think that, ultimately that's where we're all going, right? We're all going to utility, availability of these products. But it also comes down to, who's controlling your data, right? Do you want to have control of your data on your prem, or are you willing to, relinquish possession of your data with a trusted partner and run your applications that way? And it's really going to depend on your workloads, what your business is, and what your business values that is really going to drive that decision. But if I had to answer that, I'm going to say, right now, hybrid cloud is still the solution that is taking up a huge portion of the market, and then cloud native new companies taking their production into the cloud.
Yeah, I think that first off, if you're a small, medium business, using the cloud to me is a no-brainer, right? If you have limited budget, if you have limited resources, and therefore you can only do so much internally, leveraging the cloud should be at the top of your list. Now, having said that, and I'm just going to echo what Derek said, is typically the way we've seen hybrid, and even if for small, medium businesses applies, it's taking a look at what you're trying to accomplish, what is your core business, what are you uniquely qualified to do yourself or have to do internally, and then what can you outsource? So I'll give you an example. We've got small, medium businesses that are doing a lot more with analytics, things like big data, right? It's no longer, it's not just for massive companies, right? And so they basically see the use of big data as a differentiator because it allows them to surgically spend their budget based on actual analysis of the data. Now, in a lot of cases, they will put the heavy lifting of the analysis either on-prem or in a managed, basically a private cloud, right? Because they feel that they need the horsepower or the access or whatever the case may be to do that. But they'll take the reporting, the results that they want to communicate. They have customers, for example, that maybe buy those reports. They'll push them out into the cloud, because out in the cloud, they have micro controls over who has access. They can expire links. They can do all kinds of things, and there's no need for them to take up internal resources to have to do that. Because again, it's a pay-as-you-go model. So as they expand, their costs will go up. Now, there has been cases where small, medium companies have have gotten so large so quickly that they've actually run the analysis that cloud is starting to cost them more money than maybe doing it on-prem. But it's certainly an outlier with most small and medium businesses, right? The issues, again, the technology, the people, the money, and the processes. If you're a small and medium business, you should definitely be looking at it. And if you're not comfortable with moving to the cloud because you're afraid of misconfigurations, that's when you find a partner that basically will act on your behalf to set you up, do the configurations, even do the training to still allow you to take the advantages of it and offload some of that knowledge for them to be able to set you up and make sure that you're properly secure. So that's the way I would look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing I'll say is I love that you guys keep going back to it depends, because that is the most true thing in IT there ever is. And there's so many IT pros who aren't willing to go out and tell their own bosses it depends. I had to do that all. So, with the thought of, hey, you're just getting into starting to use a cloud service provider, maybe you're one of those companies that's looking into starting to do some hybrid cloud. Eric Wojo is wondering, is there any wording that they should really be paying attention to in the cloud provider contract agreements? Anything they should really be looking for? What's a red flag versus what's great?
Well, again, in those same documentations, the online documentation I mentioned at the beginning, is you want to understand what the shared responsibility is, right? You want to understand where, and again, this is probably the biggest one, is where does the cloud provider's responsibility stop and start? Where does the customer pick up on it? Typically, that line is, and the way I think that that Azure and AWS talk about this is, it's security of the cloud, and then security of what's in the cloud, right? Of the cloud is typically what the provider will provide, right? If you go again to Microsoft and you look at their SOC 1, 2, and 3 attestation report from their audit, that's basically what they're covering themselves for when it comes to customers, is they want to make sure that from a physical infrastructure perspective, whether it's access, who can get into the server room and things like that, they've dotted the I's and crossed the T's. Once you start getting into the data that you actually put into the cloud, then again, every provider is going to use different wording. You want to take a look at data authorization provisions, for example, right? Who has access to your data? Does anybody have access to your data? I mean, ideally, if you're dealing with sensitive data, you should never have it in the cloud. You should never have it sitting anywhere unless it's encrypted. Right, and so again, it falls back to the customer to ensure that they do that. This is another one of those topics, again, that depending on what you're trying to accomplish, is going to change what you need to look at. It isn't a single paintbrush. I think, though, to sort of hopefully provide a more solid answer to this. If you go through the trust centers and you go through and, you can Google AWS for the exact URL, compliance certification and so forth, there is a ton of information out there. I would say probably 90+% of the questions that you have will be answered in those. And then the additional 10% goes back to the prior question about if you're working with a partner and you want to go into some more detail, you can have the partner ask on your behalf, or ask the partner. Again, CenturyLink, I get asked all the time, you guys work with AWS, can you tell me about this? And then if I don't know, I'll call the the partner alliance team that deals with that vendor, and we'll get the answer.
You sort of answered a little bit of this next question in your last answer, but I think it's a great one to ask. I came from a healthcare organization before coming to Spiceworks, so anytime I see something healthcare related, I ask it. From Brandon Clone 1, there must be more than one of them out there. Oh, and then they just moved. Everybody started talking. they're for a small healthcare office that deals with PHI and HIPAA, what is a key benefit to look for when looking at different vendors? You mentioned encryption on data at rest. Are there more really important things they should be looking for?
Yeah, and again, here, when it comes to HIPAA and PCI, there's a couple of things to understand. PCI actually has a certification that you obtain, that you're mandated if you are if you collect credit card information, deal with transactions, depending on the size organization, you have to do an annual audit for that. HIPAA doesn't have a certification. HIPAA it's a security rule, both physical and administrative, and then you can get somebody to audit you, but there isn't a specific certification that you get, which is a huge amount of confusion in the industry about that. I get those questions all the time. So, but for either one of those, one collects personal health information, one collects electronic transaction data, but otherwise, a lot of the controls are similar. So encryption at rest, paramount, right? You want to make sure that you're reviewing your logs. You want to make sure that your physical controls are in place. You want to make sure that you know who has access to what. You want to make sure that your data, even encrypted, is not only backed up, but when we talk about ransomware, one of the things I reinforce, and again, Derek, you guys probably see this all the time, is not only back it up, but have a backup that's not physically connected to your network. Right? That way, if you do get hit with ransomware and they start encrypting things in your network, they're not going to be able to access your backup, and you can recover. See it all the time. Yep, I have a backup. What happened to it? It was also encrypted. So again, whether you're a small or large organization, when you're dealing with, again, with HIPAA, you're going to see on all of the major CSPs' websites, they're going to address HIPAA. They're going to address it from the perspective of, yep, we've actually audited and we certify our physical environment. And by certified, I don't mean HIPAA certification. I just mean it's a certification that maps to the types of things that the HIPAA compliance framework wants you to do. But there's a lot of similarities between PCI and HIPAA when it comes to protecting data. It's just that the data is different. So I usually tell customers that are healthcare facilities that both accept credit cards for the transaction, at the point of service, but they also deal with healthcare data, so they're mandated for both of them. Typically, if you're covering yourself for one, you're probably going to cover almost the entirety for the other, if that makes sense. And so whether you're a small or large business, like I said, the big difference between the two is there's no official certification within the HIPAA world. You're self-certifying and saying, if there's a breach and I have patient information, that it's protected, and all of a sudden it's not going to make the news like it did with with Aetna, not Aetna, but Anthem and so forth, where 1 million personal health records were were out in public. So
yeah, and you brought up a good point there, Terry, too, about having the data offsite in addition to your replication protection. One of the strong points of Zerto is there's no impact on production. Additionally, we can give you an offsite backup that runs from the recovery site. So, that continues and furthers on the story of no impact on production. I think that's really important when you're talking about being able to recover, running ongoing operations. You don't want to have an impact. You don't want to degrade your environment because you're running data protection, right? That's typically what happens with backup. You are suffering a little bit in terms of, the amount of space you need and, the amount of time it takes to restore anything. So being able to use Zerto to have your data in those two places, one where you can easily restore, and then having that third offsite location. If you talk about, the hurricanes we had last fall, where, there's a parking lot of hurricanes down in the Caribbean coming up through Florida, up the East Coast. We had a couple professional sports teams that were able to leverage our one-to-many feature. With that, you can protect a VM or an application in multiple virtual protection groups that are consistency protected. And those can go to different locations. So what they were able to do, they had data center in Florida, data center in Atlanta. There was going to be a hurricane over both those locations. They did not want their data sitting there. They were able to migrate that data before the storm. So I think being able to have the flexibility with your data to be able to move it between clouds, to move it between cloud tiers, and have the ability to measure out value and performance, all while having this partner that's managing your security in the cloud, giving you the guidance that you need to be able to set your cloud up. This is all a winning formula in terms of IT resilience and being able to maintain your site, maintain your data, keep it protected, not lose it, not lose the business, not lose your job. Zerto can help you with all of that.
Awesome. I love that you guys are basically bringing up the cloud-based idea of the good old 3-2-1 rule.
You got
when
it.
It comes to backups. I mean, it's those things that always stick around. They're worth keeping in mind, and it just doesn't matter if it's new tech or not. Bring that new stuff into it.
Disk is so cheap. Disk is so cheap now. Backup. When does backup become irrelevant? Right? It's why not have a full copy available to restore? Within minutes. So,
exactly. I've got 16 tear in my home lab. A business can do it too.
Nice. Nice.
So
I'm gonna want a tour of that.
Huh?
I said I'm gonna want a tour of that. Your lab.
It's really easy. It's small. You can see it in the lower corner. So Zach 5769 asks, are there real considerable differences between large CSPs and small CSPs? How do you make the decision between the two, whether to go with someone huge or someone that might be a little maybe local to your area and a smaller CSP? But what are some things to think about there?
Yeah, what are the driving factors, right? What's the driving factor behind the business? I think with some of the smaller CSPs, you might see companies that are a lot more vertical focused on a specific vertical. We have a CSP that handles just small accounting firms. So that would be an example of what a small CSP could possibly do in one specific vertical. But other than that, it's really matching up with the best partner for what your situation is. Value is important. Pricing is important. Protection is important. These are all things that are generally taken care of by these CSPs. There may be higher degrees of compliance, higher degrees of security, and obviously there's larger teams with more knowledge, at these larger CSPs that are working on these things on a daily basis. So a smaller CSP focusing on verticals, that may be great. A larger CSP is going to be able to give you assistance across the board on just about everything. So that's my thoughts.
Well,
I think that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
I just echo what Derek said. I mean, there's the four big cloud providers. They have the bulk of the market. Once you go behind them, anybody from Oracle, Alibaba, even Rackspace, it becomes more of a niche play. It's either They're a cloud provider that's providing, Oracle's a perfect example, right? It's Oracle Cloud, but it's predominantly for the Oracle products. Derek is laughing because, yeah, whether it's a real cloud or not is to be determined. But you're usually dealing with niche. You're not necessarily dealing with a company that doesn't care about security any less, because again, if you're going to take on customers, you're going to host them on a platform, then your business depends on making sure that they are secure. But that's really where you see you could certainly see differences. Again, Derek, I think, mentioned it in terms of pricing, depending on what you're doing. But that's where those second tier, as I would call them, providers, the smaller CSPs, fall in line. Is they tend to be more niched, or they tend to go after a value point that is not in the interest of the big four, either because the big four are of such scale that it's been if you look at storage alone, I think Derek said it earlier, it's been a race to the bottom, right? How little can I charge for 1 gig of storage and so forth? And so I think it really comes down to niche. So if there's something very specific that you're trying to do, then I think I wouldn't even call them smaller CSPs. I would call them tier 1 and tier 2, really. Then the tier 2s may be something to consider. However, I have found it, with the continued growth of both AWS and Azure in particular, and what you can do in those clouds, it really just comes down to, knowing how to configure them and knowing what you're trying to get out of them. It's not the lack of capabilities for you to do pretty much anything you want to do.
All right. And I'm going to do, I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry, guys.
Let's give out a prize.
Yeah, well, we're actually at a point. Do you guys have any final advice for our IT pros here on, when it comes to cloud security? What's a great takeaway that everyone should get from this webinar, whether they've spent the whole time listening or they're just tuning in at the end to get the prize?
Yeah, I want to add something. Go ahead, Derek.
No.
Sorry, latency.
Please.
Well, let's go, Derek, first.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I would just say identity and access control is huge. That's a huge point, but really it's finding that correct partner for you specifically and your needs to lock arms with, like I said, and be able to perform these tasks that, if you're trying to do them on your own, searching through Google to get this done, it's not going to go well. These people are working on these things, these types of services every single day. They're experts at them. And, you don't want that learning curve. Trust me, I've done it. It's painful. Grab someone that's already done it, already been in the trenches, knows what it takes, and, you'll be in good hands.
Very well put, Derek. And I will just add, and I think I'm also going to answer this one question that Jimmy T had about examples of controls. I echo what Derek said. You're find a partner that eats, lives, and sleeps this sort of thing all the time. But in the meantime, if you want to become better educated, a great document is go out to the SANS.org, the SANS Institute, in their InfoSec reading room, and take a look at implementing the critical security controls in the cloud. It basically will give you a guideline to specific controls that everybody should implement. The examples they give is based on AWS, but you can apply them to any cloud environment. So that'll provide you better education, and then when you follow that up with speaking to a partner or a provider that can help you get into the cloud, then you're also going to be speaking the same language. So I offer that as, hopefully that answers Jimmy's question as well.
Awesome. That's what I was hoping to have time for. And then I was like, oh, we're running out. Well, thanks to everyone for joining us today. Thank you guys for being able to be here and give us so much great information for the IT pros. I know that the audience is starting to wonder, who's the winner of that Ring doorbell? We talk about cloud security this whole time, and now we're giving away a nice Internet of Things device. So good luck on your security, guys. But congratulations to, how do I pronounce that? Moikers. Send us a email to mattY@spiceworks.com. you are the winner today. We'll get you that doorbell. And, everybody be sure to check out our future webinars and take a look at, some of the resources we have here from CenturyLink and Zerto. And thanks for being here, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for your time.
Take care.